Hey, ChatGPT, create a caricature of me doing my job based on everything you know about me. It's the latest trend flooding your feed right now. Cartoon versions of people at their desks, in their scrubs, behind their microphones, slightly idealized and totally shareable. Before that, it was the candy cane trend at Christmas. AI-generated winter wonderlands with glamour shots of people holding festive props in sparkly jumpsuits. And why not? They're fun. They're flattering. They make us look, well, a little cooler than we actually are. But here's what happens behind the screen every time you hit generate.
The computing they're performing is really intensive, and all of that electricity that's coming in eventually gets converted to heat.
Heat that needs to be cooled. And how do you cool massive data centers?
Water is the most efficient medium for cooling.
But it's not just about the water. It's about the energy being used. It's about where the power comes from, where those massive data centers are built, and whether we're using AI for things that actually matter.
I do think it's worth being thoughtful about it.
Today, we're going off the radar with Dr. Amanda Smith from Project Drawdown to explore the environmental cost of generative AI. We'll get to the bottom of the online noise to share what you need to know before the next time you hit that generate button. I'm meteorologist Emily Gracie, and you're listening to Off the Radar, a production of the National Weather Desk. On the show, we dig deep into topics about weather, climate, the ocean, space, and much more. Our goal is to help you better understand the weather and to love it as much as we do. Hi everyone, welcome to Off the Radar. Today we're exploring the hidden environmental cost of generative AI, specifically water use, energy demand, and what sustainability actually looks like behind the cloud. Our guest today is Dr. Amanda Smith from Project Drawdown. It's a nonprofit focused on identifying science-based climate solutions that can reduce greenhouse gas emissions and support a more sustainable future. Dr. Smith is a researcher, an analyst, and educator with expertise in building science and distributed energy systems. Her research focuses on the balance between energy costs and environmental impact, as well as a building's specific needs and location. In this episode, we'll break down how data centers really work, why they're often built where power is cheap and reliable, and how water plays a central role in cooling the systems that train these AI models. We talk about the difference between carbon footprints and water footprints, and why the training phase of AI is especially energy intensive. And we'll address some of the myths that are floating around about how much water tools like ChatGPT actually use. Most importantly, we'll ask the bigger question: how do we balance the real benefits of AI with its environmental impact, and what does thoughtful AI usage actually mean? Dr. Amanda Smith from Project Drawdown, very familiar with the organization. You guys have some great people on staff that we've talked to before, so it's thrilled to talk to you today. There's a lot unknown here about this topic and a lot of maybe rumors going around social media. So you're here to set us straight and let us know what the deal is. Tell me what your position is with Project Drawdown.
So I'm a senior scientist for the built environment. And what that means is I look at the information we're putting out around climate solutions for buildings, the electricity sector, industry, transportation, and the fossil fuel sector, and make sure that it's consistent with the science and understandable to our key audiences.
And that's Project Drawdown's whole mission, right? Is a very solutions-based look at climate change information.
Absolutely. The reason that Project Drawdown came into being is because I wasn't a part of it, but we wanted people to understand that we do have solutions available to address climate change, and the science shows that. And our mission now is to bring the best information that's really informed by science to people about what's been shown to work and why and where and how.
Cool. All right. Well, let's talk about AI. AI is such a broad term too. There's all these different types of AI, but I'm sure you're now familiar with kind of what is going into these AI processes. Can you talk a little bit, really bring it down to basics for our listeners about how AI works and what's powering it?
So how AI works is a huge question, but most of what we're talking about when we say AI, and especially when we're talking about data centers, is machine learning. And it's the idea that you have an algorithm, but the algorithm is going to kind of write its own instructions or find its own information based on you giving it a training set and it performing some tasks. So it's labeling or predicting, and then you can kind of give it a carrot and say that's right or that's not right. We've actually done this with language models, which is pretty amazing. And that's where things like chatbots come in, which is where most people first encounter AI. And what's really happening there is it's getting a statistical sample of whatever text was fed to it, and it's giving you the most statistically likely thing that it thinks that a person would say based on that text that's been fed to it. And the reason that it's really changing power demands, it's almost entirely powered by electricity. It's entirely powered by electricity, really. But the reason that it's changing power demands so much is that we're using computer chips to do this that are really well suited for, they used to be called graphics processing units, but they're suited to processing large amounts of information quickly and in the particular ways that are useful for AI and for machine learning. And what happens is that they use a lot more power per rack in a computer center than a typical data center would. The computing they're performing is really intensive, and all of that electricity that's coming in eventually gets converted to heat. So the more power something is drawing, the more heat it's ultimately going to put out. That's true for the laptops in front of us, right? The more power that they draw, the hotter that laptop's going to get. And that's true for a data center as well.
Okay. So where are these data centers? How many of them are there? Like, are they across the country? Are they overseas?
I'm mostly focused on the presence in the US, and we have a higher concentration of data centers than a lot of other countries, but they tend to land where power is reliable and cheap, which makes sense, I think, right? Within the US, they tend to land in places where also tax incentives and government incentives are friendly towards building new data centers. One of the things that we see within the US is that they actually tend to land in regions that have a little bit higher climate pollution per unit of electricity produced than the national average. And they also tend to land in places that are already water stressed, and a data center can exacerbate water stress. So it's a very, very hyper local problem. But what we see is that, just within the US, about a third of the data centers are believed to be in Virginia, Texas, California. So they're really landing in certain places very heavily. And it's really hard to say exactly how many data centers there are, because a data center could be a 10,000 square foot warehouse that has thousands and thousands of servers. It could be a room in an office building that's just serving that office building. It could be some mix of something in between there.
And you brought up water use. Can you talk about what that has to do with data centers? How is that involved?
Yeah. So water is the most efficient medium for cooling all of these server racks. So if you do air cooling, which is what our laptops are doing, right? Air is flowing by and the heat's getting carried away and the laptop's fine. That's not very energy efficient because it's producing so much heat, because the power is so dense in a small amount of space. And what we tend to use is water cooling. Water is very efficient at removing a large amount of heat quickly. And a lot of that's done by what's called evaporative cooling. So if you've ever driven by a power plant and seen a cooling tower, it looks like clouds are coming out. I had one of these in my hometown. It's a really cool technology. It's just like when we sweat, we cool off, right? Although I grew up in the South, it's a little hard to cool off. But in a dry climate, it's very effective, right? You start sweating, and what's happening is heat's being taken away from your body. Well, we can do that mechanically. And so what happens is we'll take some water, it'll do some cooling. That water will pick up heat. That water will go through the cooling tower. It'll evaporate into the air. It'll take a lot of heat with it. So it's a really energy efficient way to get rid of heat. So a lot of it's that. Some of it's water use for chilled water systems, which use technology similar to our refrigerator, but are chilling water instead. And there's also some indirect water use because a lot of our power generation is using water. I mentioned a power plant having a cooling tower, right? So a lot of our power plants are either cooled by a river, once through running over them, a lot of them cooled by evaporative cooling from a power plant. So using power itself also drives water use somewhere else. And if you're in a system like the Colorado River system, which is already having a lot of demands on that water, both for buildings, industry, agriculture, now you've got power plants that are trying to serve data centers, and you've got data centers themselves that are using water on site.
Wow. Okay. There's a lot of variables at play here.
Yeah.
It's interesting because when people, I think we have a common person who's just like driving by one of these data centers and sees these big puffs of clouds going in, they're thinking pollution, but it's a different thing that's happening here, right? It's water use that's happening, not pollution. Or is pollution happening too?
Pollution may be happening, but it's probably, if you're driving by a data center, it's probably water evaporating. There are specific cases where I know in Tennessee, there was an effort to put in a data center, and they actually wound up siting their own natural gas generation power facility in an area that was a low-income part of Memphis. So that pollution then, happens right there, and that's kind of directly tied to the data center. That's not typical. Usually what's happening is data centers plugging into the power grid, and then the data center itself is running cooling towers because the heat is a very, very local problem. They've got to get rid of that heat in order to keep the computing running. And so the cooling towers right there are just removing water from that water cycle and removing heat from that center. So if you're seeing that, it's probably just water evaporating, which is not in and of itself a concern. But it is a concern because when we look at if you're pulling water out of a local water system and, the municipal water supply is also counting on that, the water use tends to be a little different because if we're using water in our homes and buildings, that typically gets returned to the water system through the sewer system. And there are very specific cases where it can be kind of dangerous. So there's a town in Eastern Oregon, not too far from where I'm at in Portland, but in a very dry part of the state. And what they were seeing there is that they have already some nitrate buildup in the water. So if you have water that already has something in it that's a bit of a contaminant, when you send it through an evaporative cooling process, it's concentrating that contaminant because the water's evaporating, but anything that might be in the water is not necessarily evaporating away with it. And so you can wind up concentrating pollutants in the water itself. Some of that water does get returned from the cooling towers, just not most of it. And then that water can be a little bit harder for a typical municipal water supply system to deal with because it's more concentrated in terms of whatever they're trying to remove than the water that they're used to getting.
Are there any studies about the water that does get evaporated and where it winds up? Does it stay pretty local? Does it go into a weather system that goes across the country?
Man, that is...
Or is that a much bigger question?
That is a huge question. And yes, there are absolutely studies. I'm sure there are many, many PhD theses, and I'd be happy to connect you with some good atmospheric scientists who could really do that question justice. The way that we tend to think of it when we're looking at it, on say maybe a state-by-state basis is you're not expecting very local weather impacts from a cooling tower that would be serving a typical data center or even a typical power plant. You will see, of course, right at the plant, increased moisture, but we kind of tend to treat that as, it goes back out into the broader atmosphere. But there's always going to be really hyper-local effects if you're in between a mountain range and, you already have some sort of interesting precipitation cycle. It could definitely have effects, but
let the weather modification rumors begin.
No, there's much more to be concerned about in terms of what's happening locally.
When there are water restrictions in place for certain, towns or states, does the data center get impacted too? Or are they the first ones to be restricted, or are they the last ones to be restricted?
That really, really depends. And I'm not as familiar on the water side, and they may not be quite as far along, but I know on the power side, there have been a lot of efforts by particular states to really change the way that data centers are limited and the way that data centers pay for the electricity that they use. And so on the water side, you can do the same thing. Sometimes, for example, this town in Oregon that I just mentioned, locally, they were trying to incentivize, in the beginning, Amazon to build multiple data centers there, and they were giving them huge tax benefits. So you've got to realize the data center's looking at their whole costs, and even if water and power have demand costs, if they're getting a huge tax benefit, then that may sort of balance out if these agreements are made over a really long period of time. But you can charge water users differently based on, using more than expected, using a lot at a certain time. But there's no consistent water billing system across the U.S., and there's no consistent electricity billing system across the U.S. either.
Okay. So who knows? Um, so I think ChatGPT takes kind of like the brunt of this, attack, especially on social media. What do you know about like the ChatGPT data centers and their water usage? I see things, very, very specific accusations, and I don't know what the truth is here when it comes to like your prompt with ChatGPT just used, 2 liters of water. How do you get into specifics like that? And are those things that are thrown out there, do they have truth to them?
Probably. And a lot of people have published numbers like that. And it, of course, requires a lot of assumptions to get there. But it's general in the level of saying, um, oftentimes in the power sector, we look at how many grams of carbon equivalent pollution are created per kilowatt hour of electricity generated. And then to do that, we have to say, okay, well, here's all of the generators that I'm considering within that. Here's my assumptions about how much each one pollutes based on whether it's coal, natural gas, solar, or wind. And so what you're talking about is a water footprint, and it's just a very average thing. And what they're doing is making assumptions. They're probably assuming that the model's already trained, that you're at the inference phase, which is less energy intensive than training a new model. That's changing a little bit as ChatGPT learns to customize, and there are more and more features built in for you to train. LLM models is what I would call it. Often we say ChatGPT, but we really mean large language models. So we're starting to train them with our own data. That can be quite energy intensive too. But they're making an assumption about the kind of query that you're making, about how much computing power it takes to serve that query, and about, on average, how much electricity or how much water use per amount of computing is tied to that. And they're doing that. If they're doing it responsibly, they're doing it based on a survey of data centers, and ideally local to the region that you're in.
Okay. Yeah. And I see different kind of assumptions too, where I read one in one place that the training is where a lot of the usage is happening. Is that true? That like once it's trained, it is much more efficient?
Yeah, that's quite true. So the training phase tends to be a lot more energy intensive, and that's more of an upfront cost. But again, we do have ongoing training. So each time a new ChatGPT or Gemini model is released, they've done a lot of new training. And if you log in and feed it a lot of your data, then you are training it as you go. And that's one thing for people to be aware of too. If you're handing data to an LLM, unless you've explicitly made an agreement that it's not going to be, that's also being used to train it.
What about the carbon footprint? We talked about the water footprint. Is the carbon footprint more of a concern, less of a concern, still a big concern when it comes to these models like ChatGPT?
In terms of direct impacts on communities, usually I think water is more of a concern. But in terms of climate, they're both a concern, and they're both so intertwined because of what we can talk about as the water energy nexus that it's really even hard to make any kind of judgment. But one of the things that we see is that when we look at where data centers are really highly concentrated right now in the US and where they're growing, those tend to be places where statistically you're more likely to have electricity being generated from fossil fuels than from renewables, even compared with the average of the US as a whole. So that means, again, this is very on average, but they're more likely to be drawing on power that's a little bit dirtier. So that's a concern. Right. The other concern is when we start looking forward and we say, okay, data centers are right now less than 5% of US electricity consumption. And that includes all data centers. That's not just attributed to AI.
Oh.
But if they grow, if they double from now to 2030, we're looking at an increase in power demand that we really haven't seen probably in this century. Power growth in the US from like the 40s to the 90s took off. And we're seeing a little bit of a leveling of demand. So this is kind of unsettling people whose jobs are to plan for the stability and reliability of the power grid and to make sure that we have enough generation to meet demand, because it's a little uncertain. It is a boom right now. And some of the projections are quite dramatic, but we know that those loads are going to continue to grow. So yeah, I do want to make that point. I know you kind of gasped. A lot of people say AI power use. We, on the power side, don't have any way of saying this much is going to AI and this much is not. And that's also sometimes a fuzzy line. So what we see is that data centers overall are like 4 to 5% of US electricity use, according to the IEA estimates. And just a decade ago, that was like 1 or 2%.
So yeah, AI is definitely going to continue to grow. So Project Drawdown, you guys are solutions based. What's like the ideal way to do this? Like if this growth is inevitable, is there like a better way to cool it other than water? Have you guys started working on solutions that are specific to this?
Yeah, so what we do is we compile the information about who's working on solutions, and we give you a sense of what's most promising and where and why. And so maybe we can kind of take the power and water aspects of that separately at first. On the power side, the ideal is that you have stable, predictable, and adjustable power demands. That makes it easier for the grid to then serve those demands with clean power. So if we see growth, we want to see growth that's more predictable, more gradual, and we want to be able to adjust loads to when clean power is available. That allows us to integrate more renewables and continue the phase down of coal, which in this century has been also really dramatic and has made a big change in how clean or dirty our pollution is from power plants. So to do that on the demand side, you can make your data centers efficient. You can make them responsive to conditions on the grid. On the grid side, we can make the grid itself a lot more efficient. We can put transmission and distribution infrastructure in between demands and where clean power supply is available. And we can continue to roll out clean power as quickly as we can and make sure that it's integrated with the power system overall so that we maintain the level of reliability that we have in this country, which is really high. On the water side, we do have some new cooling technologies that are really promising in terms of directly cooling the chips themselves. There are other environmental concerns with that sometimes. I actually have a good friend who's an expert on this. If you ever want to dig into the cooling of data centers, she would be a really fun person to talk to. It's pretty amazing the technologies that are coming out. Yeah.
Like what? Like, do you have any examples? Like, I can't even like fathom anything. Like,
that's. Yeah. So that's our first try, basically, is blowing on it, blowing air past it and cooling it. And that's kind of like your top line first thing you would think of. The most common one, and the thing that I think is really going to have a hold for a long time, is evaporative cooling, because it's just like such an easy way. And a lot of these places are arid already. It's such an easy way to take away a lot of heat at once and with a low energy usage. And oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes they may be more concerned about their power bill. So like monetarily, they're getting judged on how much power usage there is going to the facilities versus going to the IT itself. And they really want to make sure all the power that they're paying for is going to the IT itself. So evaporative cooling is like a really, really effective way to do that. There are, incremental improvements in evaporative cooling and in water chillers, but these are technologies that we've had for decades. So I don't expect to see a huge leap forward in those types of technologies. Some of it's inherent to the technology itself, which is like, if you're evaporating water, you are taking it out of that water system and you can be as efficient as possible with it, but you can't avoid doing that.
And the irony too is like the use of AI to help with some of these different sustainability impacts, right? Like there's so many ways that that AI is being used to help.
Yeah, there's a lot of excitement around how AI could help us do our work as scientists and researchers and engineers in making things more energy efficient and integrating renewables and being water efficient. And I kind of think about it like spending some money to try to make yourself save money. So I pay a monthly fee to a service that helps me organize all my bills and set a budget. And I am spending money, but I think that the return I get in terms of being able to save money is worth it. So I'm clear that paying that little monthly fee is worth it. To me, I'm going to ultimately save more money. And that's kind of the way we have to think about AI. Now, on the research front, sometimes you do things that are quite expensive in terms of computing power because you're doing something new. And the idea is that you can then develop it further. But on the deployment side, the question we have to ask ourselves is the power and water use that's tied to these computer queries worth whatever savings we're expecting on the other end? And from an engineering standpoint, you really want to ask yourself the question, do I need to have a human in the loop anyway? Like, is this a task that's really served well to a computer system that's unsupervised or lightly supervised? Or is this something where it might actually even be better to have humans do it?
And then like on an individual basis, because that's what everybody thinks about, right? Like, what am I doing wrong? What can I do to help? I also read somewhere that like video conferencing, like what we're doing right now, recording this, is using these same sort of resources, the power resources, the water resources that say like a ChatGPT would. And so focusing on like you asking ChatGPT for something, you have to look at all of your practices. Is there truth to that, the video conferencing?
There is truth to that, but I would say, and I don't know a lot about your lifestyle, but I would say probably between you and I, if we really want to worry about the environmental impact of our electricity consumption, having these Zoom meetings is not something we really need to stress about. There's also a lot of evidence that people who work from home or people who are not traveling in a car, a personal private car every day for work, are saving a lot in terms of environmental pollution. So you also kind of have to consider what's the alternative to what I'm doing. And if it's not having Zoom meetings, sure, if I never had Zoom meetings, I would be asking for less computing resources, and ultimately that would be better. But I wouldn't get to connect with people. I wouldn't get to talk to my coworkers. I'd be at home with my cat all day. So we have to ask the question of what's the alternative to what I'm doing? And that's why the solutions focus at Project Drawdown, I think, is so important, because we're not explicitly going out and pointing the finger and saying, stop doing this. There are things we should stop doing, but we're asking the question of what can we do instead? How do we build a better world where people are thriving and healthier and our actions are not taxing particular communities and creating a lot of climate pollution?
So should we be frivolous with our use of ChatGPT? Should we ask it to create a, glamour shot of us with a giant candy cane at Christmas time? Or should we be a little bit more cautious about how we're using it?
I don't think we should, because I've seen enough of these doctored Christmas time photos. It's January when we're recording, so I think we can call that off. No, I do think it's worth being thoughtful about it. A lot of the things that we're doing would actually be served just as well by a standard search query, which could be 10 times or more efficient than making an AI query. And I'm not against people having fun and trying out the capabilities of a new AI model. But if that's, all that you do daily, I think there's a lot of benefit to learning to create on your own, to using simple search queries where you can, and just asking yourself, especially if you're in an enterprise organization where you have an agreement with an AI company and you're using it a lot, maybe you can be one of the ones who's thoughtful about, is this something that AI is really well suited to? Is this actually making us more efficient at our work? If your work is making the power grid more efficient, making buildings more efficient, working for climate, then great. We want to accelerate that. And sometimes a little cost is okay. I think also supporting local initiatives that protect water systems, supporting local initiatives that protect residents from price increases on domestic water, or on residential power bills are really important. So if you're someone who's involved and aware of like what your local public utility commission is doing or what your state is doing to try to make sure that data center costs are aligned with the prices that they're paying, I think that makes sense too.
So there is a noteworthy difference between typing something into Google and typing a question into ChatGPT.
Noteworthy, yes.
Amanda, is there anything else you want to add on this topic? This has been very educational.
One thing to know on electricity is, a lot of people aren't aware because they see their home power bill and you're generally getting just a price per kilowatt hour. They're not aware that industrial and commercial users have a very complex rate schedule of prices. And so I say that because there are a lot of options for how data centers are charged. We're seeing a lot of innovation in pricing schemes and in trying to make new what's called rate schedules, which tells you how you're going to get charged for power, that are customized to data centers that really reflect the kind of particular ways that they use power. And I think that's interesting and it makes sense. The projections, that power use for data centers could double by 2030 may be a bit aggressive. But even if that happens, we're looking at about 10% of the US power demand. So at a national scale or a global scale, this is not a huge issue. Just really want to emphasize it's a very, very local issue.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for all this information today. This has been great.
Yeah, thanks for reaching out. It's really nice to meet you.
Off the Radar is a production of the National Weather Desk. Make sure you're following the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. New episodes publish every Tuesday morning. Thanks to Dr. Amanda Smith for her expertise today. If you're interested in learning more about climate solutions, check out Project Drawdown. Thanks to the National Weather Desk and Sinclair Broadcast Group for their ongoing support of the podcast, and to Brian Petrus for his help with today's episode. I'm meteorologist Emily Gracie. Make it a great day.